You'll recall that Emerson, in his 1836 Nature, at the end of the language section, says that every age has its prophet that sees the Sphinx by the roadside and tries to solve its riddle. Emerson's sense in that first book of his Nature is that there are ultimately no questions that nature inspires that we cannot answer with the help of nature. Certainly, Emerson, as he developed as a thinker up into experience in 1844, realized more and more that the world was ultimately inscrutable. This is an insight he had along with Melville, that ultimately we cannot understand the nature of the world. And part of what inspired this conclusion in Emerson was the death of his young son Waldo. We know all about that. I bring this up because Emily Dickinson was a poet who sought out riddle for the sake of riddle. She did not want to solve riddles. For her, riddles that could be solved were done and boring, not interesting at all. She was interested in moments, in creatures, in events that were irreducibly enigmatic. In her mind, the enigma of the natural world, the enigma of the spiritual world, were ultimately inspirations to the imagination. If I look at an enigma and I know that this will remain an enigma, I can interpret it for the rest of my life. For some people, this might be frustrating. Oh no, I want to know, what does it mean? Let me solve this riddle. But Dickinson's no, something that will remain a riddle, that will remain an enigma, is an invitation to think about that enigma or riddle endlessly, to imagine solutions to that enigma or that riddle endlessly. She says in one poem, the riddle we can guess, we speedily despise. She says in another poem, tell all truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies. So if the first stanza I just quoted really emphasizes the role of riddle, the second emphasizes the role of ambiguity. Even if I have a truth, I don't want to tell it to you directly. I want to tell it to you indirectly, so you have to work to try to understand it. So she's very much a poet in favor, not so much of reaching conclusion. She has a poem called This World Is Not Conclusion, the species stands beyond. She works not for a conclusion, values not conclusion so much as the process, the action of thinking and imagining. Many of her poems read like riddles. I told you in another lecture that many of her poems are like definitions in a surreal dictionary, where you look up a word you think you know and suddenly there's this bizarre meaning attached to it. This is an example of catachresis, which is a kind of awkward putting together of two different words, or it can be a mixed metaphor. Hope is a thing with feathers. Well, that one's not so bad. Pain has the element of blank. What is that? This was a poet. It is that distills amazing sense from ordinary things. Pain has an element of blank. I think I just said that. I don't know. But the point is that is one kind of Dickinson poem. The poem of, let's say, creative definition. Well, another kind of Dickinson poem is the riddle. And many of her poems read as straight up riddles, but riddles without solutions. She doesn't give the solution, in other words. We might be able to figure it out. One of the most famous riddle poems are devoted to animals, but some are devoted to natural process. She has a riddle poem devoted to a butterfly, a riddle poem devoted to a woodpecker, say. One most famous riddle poem is A Narrow Fellow in the Grass, where she describes this odd streaking thing that rushes through the grass, never telling us it's a snake. All we know is that when this creature slides eerily through the grass, it doesn't make one feel happy and familiar like other animals do. It makes one feel the zero at the bone. Another riddle poem that describes not an animal but a natural process or a natural event, a natural body, would go like this. And everywhere of silver with ropes of sand to keep it from effacing the track called land. Well, that's the ocean. which is another poem along these lines that describes the snow. And the most famous riddle poem, I believe, that Dickinson has, and indeed the poem that kind of best expresses, I believe, her way of perceiving is A Rout of Evanescence. It goes like this: a rout of evanescence with the revolving wheel, a resonance of emerald, a rush of cochineal, and every bush adjusts its tumbled head. The mail from Tunis, probably an easy morning's ride. You see this blur of red and green and this propeller like motion, and you never actually see what this is in a distinct way. You can only see it after it's gone. You see the bush that is shaking because this creature has been there. Of course, it's a hummingbird. So what we see here with Dickinson is this effort almost to capture the world before putting a name on it. That's one primary function of her riddle poems. They work in this way like what we call abstract art, like the art of Jackson Pollock or Juan Miro, where you see splotches and shapes that don't yet conform to a coherent concept. Well, of course, that's how the world would appear to us if we did not have these concepts in our head that shape the world into these cogent units. Annie Dillard famously, in her book Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, talks about people who had cataracts their whole lives and how suddenly after the cataracts were removed, all they saw were these splotches of color and these buzzes of light because the internal map inside of their head did not match what actually was going on outside of their head. Of course, we who grew up sighted conform the world to our map. Things are thinks in this regard. So a poem like A Rout of Evanescence or a poem like An Arrow Fell in the Grass and others emphasize how weird the world is when we can't, before we name it. When we name the world, we tame it and we make it predictable. And so the riddle is one way to kind of foreclose that. So that's one kind of riddle poem, I think, for Dickinson. The foreclosure or the shutting down briefly of our meaning making machine so we can experience the world in all its rawness and freshness and weirdness. But then, of course, we will bring the solution to the riddle and we will solve it, and then suddenly, oh, it's a hummingbird, and move on. But we have that experience while reading the poem of being freed from the familiarizing concepts of our minds. Now, there's another kind of riddle poem, I think, for Dickinson. It's a little harder to name. And that's where she describes, I'm going to say, emotional moments or psychological moments that are so unnerving, so strange that she doesn't know what they mean. Usually these poems take place in a situation where one might expect a revelation to occur. Imagery of light often occurs in these poems. Imagery of death often occurs in these poems. So we might expect some sort of revelation, but in fact the opposite occurs. And the poet is faced with some very unsettling, unnerving riddle that totally undercuts her, how shall I put it, epistemological expectations. We can think of, in this regard, if I heard a fly buzz when I died, where the poet is on the deathbed and just right before she's getting ready to die, when she might expect some kind of religious revelation, living in a Christian culture, suddenly a fly interposes between her and the window with a blue, uncertain, stumbling buzz. So this would be a moment of a deep, inscrutable happening that undercuts the desire for revelation. Another poem that does this is one of my favorites. There's a certain slant of light. There's a certain slant of light, winter afternoons, that oppresses like the heft of cathedral tunes. Heavenly hurt it gives us, we can find no scar, but internal difference where the meanings are. None may teach it, any. It is the sealed despair, an imperial affliction sent us of the air. When it comes, the landscape listens, shadows hold their breath. When it goes, 'tis like the distance on the look of death. A slant of light coming into the window on a winter afternoon. You might think, oh, this is a moment of hope. We have light in winter. We have revelation in a time of darkness. But it's quite the opposite. The light is a slant. It's indirect. It's enigmatic. And it oppresses us, but like religious songs, which don't normally oppress. What does that mean? no one can teach it to us. Anyone can teach it to us. What does that mean? It's the seal despair. Okay, so is it a marker of how sad the world is? Is this slant of light a marker of, does it remind me of my own depression? An imperial affliction sent us of the air. Well, wait a minute. The air, spirit, imperial connected to spirit. Isn't this godly? Is God sending us this affliction? What does this mean? Are we like Job then? When it comes, it, by the time we get to that last stanza, that pronoun it can refer to almost all of these various ways to describe the light. So we don't know what that it refers to. And when it comes, there's this sense of anticipation. And when it goes, there's this sense of, oh my gosh, what just happened? It's like the distance on the look of death. How riddling can that be, to think about looking at a dead face when you're alive, and how that this person who was just in front of you seconds ago, living like you're alive, has now passed on into Lord knows where. Has this person gone to heaven? Has this person gone to hell? Has this person simply become a piece of wood, basically? We don't know. So there's a certain slant of light, like I heard a fly buzz when I die, or these moments of spiritual / emotional / psychological confusion, which would be a much deeper, unsettling kind of riddle than the ones that we get with the often charming animal riddles.